The garrote tightened around my neck. A masked figure loomed over me in the library stacks, his breath hot through the fabric. My fingers clawed at the wire, but the scalpel in my pocket was my only chance, engraved with the medical school's founder's initials. If I didn't fight back now, the truth about Thorne's research would die with me. Blood roared in my ears as I swung the textbook. The impact sent him stumbling back, gasping. Rain pounded outside, but the real storm was here. Someone wanted me silent, and I had just stolen the one thing that could expose them all. The radiator hissed, a rhythmic metallic wheeze that pulsed through the cramped dorm room. Sarah Miller pressed a red pushpin into the drywall, the plaster yielding with a dull, gritty crunch. She wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead, leaving a faint smudge of graphite across her brow. The air in the room tasted of stale coffee and the metallic tang of old copper pipes, a scent that had become her constant companion over the last 3 months. Her fingers traced the jagged perimeter of the Green River silhouette maps pinned to her wall. Red yarn crisscrossed the paper, a web of arterial spray connecting the riverside parks to the university's architecture wing. Every string, every calculated measurement of distance and time converged on a single name printed at the bottom of a stolen syllabus: Professor Julian Thorne. Outside in the hallway, the world continued its mundane rotation. She heard the muffled, rhythmic thumping of bass from Mark Stevens's speakers and the shrill, carefree laughter of girls heading toward the dining hall. The sounds felt distant, like noise from another planet. Someone knocked. The wood frame of her door rattled against the lock, a sharp, invasive sound. "Sarah, you in there?" Mark's voice sounded thin and filtered through the heavy oak. "We're hitting the pub before the evening lecture. Come on, take a break." Sarah froze, her hand hovering over a blurred crime scene photo. The scent of her own unwashed hair clung to her, a reminder of the 48 hours she had spent in this 8-by-10-foot cell of her own making. She didn't breathe until the sound of his receding footsteps finally faded into the stairwell. Only then did she turn back to her desk, where Thorne's latest monograph lay open. The margin notes she had scribbled matched the precise geometric logic of the disposal sites along the river. The connection wasn't just a theory anymore. It was a blueprint. She reached for the lamp, the plastic switch clicking under her thumb, bathing the room in a harsh, clinical yellow light that made the red yarn glow like fresh blood. She pulled out her phone, her thumbs flying over the screen. She opened her apology log app and typed, "Mark, 5:14 p.m. Ignored his invitation. Severity, 3. It was entry number 1433. The digital ledger was the only thing that kept her upright, a way to quantify the space she took up in the world. Her mother had always said she was a burden. The log was Sarah's way of keeping the receipt. The next evening, the campus felt heavier than usual. The towering Gothic spires of the university seemed to lean inward, the limestone arches pressing down like the ribs of a giant stone beast. Sarah moved through the shadows, her heartbeat a frantic drum against her ribs. She wasn't supposed to be in the administrative building after hours. But the Art of the Void thesis wasn't enough. She needed the institutional history. The air in the dean's hallway smelled of ozone and ionized air from the high-end filtration system. It made the back of Sarah's throat feel dry and metallic, making it difficult to swallow. She reached the heavy mahogany door of Dean Robert Taylor's office. Her hand trembled as she slid the stolen master key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, expensive click. Inside, the office was a vacuum of silence. She didn't turn on the lights. Instead, she used a small pen light, the beam cutting through the dark like a scalpel. She moved to the filing cabinets, her fingers dancing over the labels until she found the one marked Historical Disciplinary. Restricted. The metal drawer groaned as she pulled it open, a sound that felt loud enough to wake the gargoyles on the roof. She flipped through the folders until she found it. A thick, manila envelope, dated 20 years ago. As she pulled the documents out, the scent of old, rotting paper filled her nose. These weren't just academic records. They were reports of unregulated biological experiments and disappearance settlements. The university's prestigious Ivy League image was a mask, a layer of expensive paint over a rotting wall. She saw Thorne's name in a footnote regarding a student who had withdrawn after a lab incident. The girl had never been seen again. Sarah's hands shook so violently, the paper rattled. She stuffed the file into her messenger bag just as a heavy footfall echoed in the marble hallway outside. She ducked behind the dean's massive desk, her knees hitting the carpeted floor. She could hear the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of security boots. She squeezed her eyes shut, counting the ceiling tiles in her mind. 36, 37, just as the dean did during his meetings. The light from a flashlight swept across the room, illuminating the single, perfectly sharpened scalpel that sat on a velvet cloth on the desk above her head. The beam lingered, then moved on. The door clicked shut. Sarah waited 5 minutes, her lungs burning, before she scrambled out the window and onto the fire escape. The cold rain of a New England autumn soaking her to the bone. The library stacks were a labyrinth of silence and dust. Sarah sought refuge there an hour later, the stolen file tucked under her arm. The smell of wet dust and decaying leather was thick enough to coat her tongue. She walked deep into the 400s, social sciences, where the shadows were long and the flickering fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low-frequency buzz that set her teeth on edge. She was reaching for a reference book when the air behind her shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a change in pressure. She turned, but the garrote wire was already dropping over her head. The wire bit into the skin of her neck, a thin, searing line of agony. Her vision blurred into a kaleidoscope of black spots. The assailant was behind her, a heavy weight pressing into her back, smelling of peppermint and formaldehyde. Sarah's hands clawed at the air, her fingernails scraping against the rough fabric of a dark sleeve. She couldn't breathe. The world was shrinking to a single, pulsing point of pain. Her hand struck the edge of a shelf, knocking over a heavy, cloth-bound volume of The History of Silence. She didn't think. She reacted. She grabbed the book, a 5-pound brick of knowledge, and swung it backward with every ounce of terror-fueled strength she possessed. The corner of the book caught the attacker in the throat with a sickening, wet thud. The pressure on her neck vanished. The assailant stumbled back, clutching their throat, a ragged, wheezing sound escaping their lungs. Sarah didn't stay to see a face. She lunged forward, her boots thumping against the linoleum floor, the sound echoing through the empty library like a series of gunshots. She burst through the emergency exit, the alarm's wail vibrating through her very bones, and disappeared into the rainy night. The cold air hitting her raw throat like a physical blow. Safe in the shadows of a nearby alley, Sarah collapsed against a brick wall. Her breath came in ragged, sobbing gasps. She reached up to touch her neck, her fingers coming away slick with blood. But as she adjusted her bag, her foot hit something metallic on the pavement. She looked down. There, glinting under the amber glow of a street lamp, was a surgical-grade scalpel. It must have fallen from the attacker's pocket during the struggle. She picked it up, the cold metal biting into her palm. Even in the dim light, she could see a precise engraving on the handle, a stylized V entwined with a serpent. It was the crest of the university's medical school founder. A cold prickle danced across her skin. This wasn't just Thorn. This was the foundation of the school itself. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling so much she almost dropped it. She opened the apology log. Self. 9:42 p.m. I'm sorry I wasn't faster. I'm sorry I let him get that close. The next morning, the lecture hall was a cathedral of tension. Professor Julian Thorne stood at the mahogany lectern, his charcoal suit impeccably tailored, his silver stopwatch resting on the wood. He clicked it 3 times. Click, click, click. The sound cutting through the chatter of 100 students. Today, Thorne began, his voice like velvet over gravel. We discussed the return of the Green River silhouette. A new victim was found this morning at the rowing docks. A masterpiece of anatomical precision. Sarah sat in the back row, her neck wrapped in a thick scarf to hide the wire burn. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Thorne clicked his stopwatch again and looked directly at her. Some amateurs, Thorne continued, a thin smile touching his lips, believe they can map the mind of a genius with red yarn and stolen notes. They confuse data for insight. He reached into his folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. Sarah's blood turned to ice. It was her own handwritten note, a private observation about the trajectory of the third murder. He had her notes. He was using his lecture to dissect her progress, mocking her in front of the entire class. It was a public execution of her credibility. He wasn't just a killer. He was a teacher, and she was his most disappointing student. She fled the lecture hall before the final bell, the laughter of her peers ringing in her ears like a physical assault. She needed the safety of her room. She needed to see her maps, to recalibrate. But when she reached her dorm, the door was already ajar. The wood around the lock was splintered. She pushed it open, the scent of her own stale coffee replaced by a sharp, clinical smell. Ozone. Her desk had been cleared. The maps had been torn from the walls, leaving only the jagged red pushpins behind like drops of blood. She lunged for her laptop, but the screen was already glowing. There were no files, no spreadsheets, no apology log. Just a single flickering image of a black silhouette against a white background. It pulsed in time with her heartbeat. The digital intrusion was a violation more intimate than the garrote. Her room, her only sanctuary, had been turned into a glass box. Is everything okay? Sarah spun around. Mark was standing in the doorway, his baseball cap low over his eyes. He looked concerned, his brow furrowed in that easy, athletic way that usually made her feel safe. Someone was here, Mark, she whispered, her voice cracking. They took everything. Mark stepped into the room, his hand reaching out to touch her shoulder. Sarah, you're exhausted. You're seeing ghosts. Maybe the dean was right. Maybe you need to take a leave of absence. Sarah pulled away, her eyes fixed on his hands. He was cracking his knuckles. Pop, 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 pop. The 1-2-1-2 rhythm. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see a boyfriend. She saw a mirror. He was standing exactly like Thorne stood when he was waiting for a student to fail. I need to go, she said, grabbing her bag. Sarah, wait. She didn't wait. She ran. The campus festival was a riot of noise and light. The high-pitched whistle of a nearby generator vibrated in Sarah's teeth, making it impossible to hear the music or the laughter of the crowds. She pushed through the masses, her eyes darting between the masks of the revelers. She was crossing the main access road when she heard the roar of an engine. A black SUV, its windows tinted to a void-like black, lunged out of the shadows. It didn't swerve. It didn't break. Sarah dove. She felt the rush of air as the metal beast missed her by inches. She hit the pavement hard, her shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. She rolled, scrambling toward a service entrance for the library basement. As she fell through the heavy steel door, she heard her phone hit the concrete. The screen shattered, the glass spraying like diamonds in the dark. She lay on the cold concrete of the stairwell, the smell of wet dust filling her lungs. She was alone. Her phone was gone. Her data was gone. She was a ghost in her own life. She stayed there for hours, watching the shadows stretch across the basement floor. When she finally emerged, the sun was setting, casting long, bruised purples across the campus. She walked toward the campus security office, thinking she would finally tell everything. But as she reached the window, she saw the digital ticker tape scrolling across the university's news screen. Professor Julian Thorne to be named Citizen of the Year. Ceremony to be held at private estate during finals gala. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. Thorne wasn't just winning, he had already won. The institution had wrapped its arms around him. If she spoke now, she wouldn't be a whistleblower. She would be a nuisance. A mentally unstable student, obsessed with a hero. She turned away from the security office and walked back toward the dorms, her mind spinning. She needed an edge. She needed to know who she was fighting. Mark's room was 3 doors down from hers. He was at the football game. She knew the schedule. She used a plastic credit card to shim the lock, a trick she'd learned from a criminal justice elective. The door clicked open. The room was too clean. It smelled of laundry detergent and cheap cologne. She went straight for his desk. In the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a stack of sports magazines, she found a leather-bound folder. She opened it, expecting letters or photos. Instead, she found a contract. It was on university letterhead, signed by Julian Thorne and the dean. Subject, Student Monitoring Initiative. Agent, Mark Stevens. Compensation, full tuition remission and accelerated PhD placement. Sarah felt the world tilt. Every date, every coincidental meeting, every time he had held her while she cried, it was all logged. He wasn't her boyfriend. He was a paid informant. He was the one who had wiped her computer. He was the one who had told Thorne where she was. She looked at the bed where they had sat just 2 nights ago. She felt a wave of nausea so strong she had to lean against the wall. She pulled out her phone, the old one she kept as a backup, and opened the apology log. But her thumb hovered over the screen. "I'm sorry," she started to type. Then she stopped. She deleted the app. If they wanted a monster, she would give them one. If Thorne wanted to discuss the art of the void, she would show him how well she had learned the lesson. She spent the next 3 days in the library, not hiding, but studying. She didn't look at crime scenes. She looked at Thorne. She memorized his cadence, his philosophy, his weaknesses. She stopped wearing her glasses. She let her hair fall in a wild, frizzy mane. She stopped apologizing. When she walked into his office on Friday afternoon, she didn't knock. She just walked in and sat down. Thorne looked up from his stopwatch. Click, click, click. "Miss Miller, I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve." "The nerve was a weakness," Sarah said, her voice cold and flat. "I was looking for the wrong thing. I was looking for victims. I should have been looking at the space they left behind." Thorne leaned back, his eyes narrowing with a predatory curiosity. "Go on. The Green River silhouette isn't about death," Sarah said, leaning forward. "It's about the removal of the unnecessary. It's about the perfection of the void. I see it now. I see what you were trying to teach me." For the first time, Thorn didn't ask a question. He just watched her. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. "I'm having a small gathering at my estate tomorrow night," Thorn said softly. "The elite of the university will be there. I think it's time you met the people who truly run this institution." "I'd be honored," Sarah said. As she walked out, she saw Mark standing in the hallway. He looked at her, his mouth opening to say something, his hand reaching for his knuckles. Sarah didn't even blink. She walked past him as if he were made of smoke. The night of the gala, the university was a ghost town. Everyone who mattered was at Thorn's Berkshire estate. Sarah arrived in a taxi, her dress a dark, bruised purple that matched the campus ivy. The house was a glass and steel monstrosity perched on the edge of a cliff, overlooking the dark woods. But she didn't go to the front door. She had a different destination. She had found a reference in the dean's stolen file to a sub-basement 4 in the library that didn't appear on any official maps. She had spent the last 6 hours navigating the steam tunnels, her skin damp with a fine sheen of sweat. She found the door behind a stack of rotting History of Silence volumes. It was secured with a heavy, rusted deadbolt. She used the surgical scalpel she'd found to pick the lock, the old metal yielding with a stubborn groan. The air inside smelled of formaldehyde and peppermint, the same scent as the man who had tried to kill her. She stepped inside and clicked on her flashlight. The room was a museum of horror. Shelves lined the walls, filled with glass jars. Inside were preserved human remains, hands, ears, eyes, each labeled with a student's name and a date. In the center of the room was a large wooden crate. Sarah pried it open with a metal ruler. Inside were the trophies from the original Green River murders 20 years ago. The rowing blazers, the silver lapel pins, the blood-stained ribbons. Thorn hadn't just studied the killer. He was the killer, and he was passing the tradition down to a new generation of scholars. It's beautiful, isn't it? Sarah spun around. Thorn was standing in the doorway, a heavy bronze bust of the university founder in his hand. He wasn't wearing his suit. He was wearing a surgical gown. The history of this school is written in the marrow of those who weren't strong enough to lead, Thorn said, stepping into the room. You were almost one of them, Sarah. But you have such a gift for the details. He lunged. Sarah didn't run this time. She grabbed a heavy glass jar from the shelf, Emily Vance, October 12th, and hurled it at his head. It shattered against his shoulder, the preserving fluid spraying across his face. Thorn roared, dropping the bust. Sarah dived for the door, but he grabbed her ankle, his fingers like iron claws. She kicked back, her heel catching him in the throat, and scrambled upward. She didn't head for the campus. She headed for the estate. She needed to show them. She needed the police to see what was in that basement. She arrived at the Berkshire mansion, her dress torn, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She saw the police cruisers parked in the driveway, their lights off. She saw Detective Hayes standing on the porch, his suit as rumpled as ever. "Detective!" she screamed, stumbling toward him. "The library, the basement, it's all there. The trophies, the bodies. Thorn is the one." Hayes didn't move. He didn't reach for his handcuffs. He just reached for his tie. 1, 2, 3. "Miss Miller," Hayes said, his voice flat and weary. "You've had a very difficult semester. The dean told us you might have a breakdown." "No. Look at my neck. Look at the scalpel." Thorn stepped out from behind the door, his hand bandaged, a glass of scotch in his other hand. He looked at her with a pitying smile. "She's been stalking me for weeks, Robert," Thorn said. I tried to mentor her, but the obsession, it's a clinical case of projection. Sarah looked at the other officers. They were all holding drinks. They were all smiling. They weren't there to arrest him. They were there for dinner. "You're all in on it," she whispered, her knees going weak. "The whole school, the whole city. We prefer to call it stewardship," the dean said, appearing from the shadows of the foyer. "Now, Sarah, let's get you some help." Hayes grabbed her arms. He didn't do it gently. He dragged her through the house, past the black glass chandelier that seemed to absorb the light, and down into the private surgical suite in the basement. The room was blindingly white. The smell of ozone was so thick she could taste it. Hayes strapped her to the table, the leather belts biting into her wrists. "You have a choice, Sarah," Thorne said, standing over her with a tray of antique, ivory-handled tools. "You can be a victim, or you can be a witness. Emily Vance chose to be a victim. She's in the next room, if you'd like to say goodbye." He handed her a small, sharp blade. "Kill her," Thorne whispered. "Prove that you understand the void. Prove that you are one of us, and you can walk out of here as the most brilliant student this university has ever produced." Sarah looked at the blade. She looked at Thorne's eyes, the hollow, empty terror behind the velvet voice. She started to laugh. It was a low, vibrating sound that started in her chest and filled the sterile room. "You think this is art?" she asked, her voice steady. "This isn't the void, Julian. This is a temper tantrum. You're just a little boy who was locked in a closet, trying to make everyone else as scared as you were." Thorne's face contorted. The triple click of his stopwatch was frantic now. "Click, click, click, click. You're a hack," Sarah continued, leaning her head back against the table. "The Green River silhouette? It's clumsy. It's loud. It's a cry for attention from a man who knows he's fundamentally unremarkable." Thorne screamed, a raw, animal sound, and lunged for her throat. But Sarah was faster. She had spent the last 3 days not just studying Thorne, but her own watch. She had rigged the internal radio frequency to broadcast to any receiver within 100 yards. "Is that why you killed them, Julian?" she shouted, her voice projected through the police scanners in the cruisers outside. "Because you couldn't be a surgeon? Because your father didn't love you unless you were holding a stopwatch?" Thorne's hands were around her neck, but the sound of sirens was already rising in the driveway. The officers outside might be complicit, but they weren't stupid. They couldn't ignore a broadcasted confession. Sarah reached into her sleeve. She hadn't spent her time at the library just reading. She had stolen a lockpick from the forensic kit Michael Davis had left unattended. The wrist restraint clicked open. She didn't use the blade Thorne had given her. She used the scalpel she had found in the library, the one with the founder's mark. As Thorne leaned in to finish what he had started, Sarah drove the blade upward, under his rib cage, with the clinical precision of a master. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah stood over his body, her breath ragged, but her hands steady. She didn't look at the blood on her dress. She walked to the sink and began to wash her hands. She used the surgical soap, scrubbing under her fingernails, her movements rhythmic and calm. When Detective Hayes burst into the room, his gun drawn, Sarah didn't even turn around. "You're late, Robert," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I've already finished the lecture." 3 weeks later, the university was a different place. The dean was in custody. The history of silence had been burned, and the Green River trophies were in an evidence locker at the FBI. Sarah Miller sat in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She watched as the forensics team carried out the glass jars from the basement. She didn't feel relief. She didn't feel sadness. She felt a cold, analytical clarity. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, digital recorder. She listened to the playback of Thorne's final moments. She didn't wince at the sound of his death. She listened to the way he had breathed, the way his heart had slowed. She stood up and walked toward the library one last time. She didn't go to the 400s. She went to the evidence locker to retrieve her files. As she looked at the crime scene photos of the Green River silhouette, she didn't see a monster. She saw a puzzle that had been solved. But there were other puzzles, other voids. A year later, in a city 300 miles away, a new crime scene was marked with yellow tape. A body had been found in a park, arranged with a geometric precision that baffled the local detectives. A woman walked under the tape. She wasn't wearing glasses. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, severe bun. She didn't apologize to the officer who tried to stop her. Sarah Miller leaned over the body. She looked at the placement of the hands, the angle of the neck. She didn't feel horror. She didn't feel the need to log an apology. She leaned in closer, a faint, knowing smile touching her lips. "The technique is improving," she whispered to the void. "But the shadow is still too wide." She stood up, straightened her parallel pens in her pocket, and began to work. The student had finally surpassed the teacher.